In the years leading up to 1941, Japan had become a military juggernaut in East Asia, carving out a brutal empire stretching across China and Southeast Asia. Facing embargoes and economic strangulation by the United States, Britain, and the Netherlands, Japan found itself at a crossroads. Oil reserves were dwindling. Without immediate action, the entire Imperial Navy would be paralyzed within a year. The choice seemed clear to Tokyo: strike swiftly and decisively, before America had time to react. But what Japanese military planners didn't expect was how completely they would misjudge the enemy's resolve. The plan for Pearl Harbor was born not out of madness or recklessness, but cold, strategic logic. Japan believed it could knock the United States Navy out of the Pacific for at least 6 months, enough time to conquer the Philippines, seize Indonesia's oil fields, and fortify a vast defensive perimeter across the Pacific. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of the attack, knew the risks. He had studied in America. He admired its industry, its spirit. But he also knew that the political leadership in Tokyo would not wait. So, the Japanese planned the unthinkable: a surprise attack on America's most important Pacific base. 6 aircraft carriers, over 400 planes, and a fleet stretching over thousands of miles of ocean were mobilized. The fleet left in absolute secrecy, sailing north and then east through remote waters, avoiding all shipping lanes. The Japanese believed, hoped, that the Americans would be caught entirely off guard. And in many ways, they were. As the sun rose over Hawaii on December 7, 1941, sailors aboard the USS Arizona, USS Oklahoma, and other vessels in Pearl Harbor were going about their Sunday routines, writing letters home, preparing for church services, some still asleep in their bunks. No one expected war. No one expected the sky to erupt in fire and steel. The first wave of Japanese planes hit at 7:55 a.m. Torpedo bombers swept in low over the water, followed by dive bombers and fighters. Explosions ripped through the harbor. Battleships shuddered and capsized. Oil fires spread across the water. The USS Arizona took a direct hit to her forward magazine and exploded with such force that she was lifted out of the water, split in two, and instantly killed over 1,000 men. Shock gripped the base. The attack had achieved complete tactical surprise. Communication centers were in chaos. Anti-aircraft crews scrambled to their posts. Some guns had no ammunition. Others fired wildly into the sky. But here is where the Japanese miscalculated. The American aircraft carriers, Lexington, Enterprise, and Saratoga, were not in port. They were at sea, and thus survived untouched. Fuel depots, dry docks, and submarine pens, critical targets for sustaining a naval war, were also left largely unscathed. The Japanese had focused on the battleships, icons of naval power in a previous era, not realizing that the age of the aircraft carrier had already dawned. More importantly, the attack, far from demoralizing the American public, ignited a wave of fury. Japanese strategists had hoped the United States, faced with a sudden and devastating loss, might sue for peace or at least accept a stalemate. They did not expect the opposite. By the end of December, recruitment offices across the country were overflowing. War bonds sold at record speed. American industry, already the most powerful in the world, began to shift into wartime production. Roosevelt's speech to Congress, declaring December 7th, a date which will live in infamy, was broadcast to millions. Within hours, the United States was at war, not only with Japan, but soon with Germany and Italy as well. And from that moment, the full might of the American war machine was set in motion. For the Japanese High Command, the early aftermath of Pearl Harbor was celebrated as a stunning success. In less than 2 hours, they had crippled the U.S. Pacific Fleet, sunk or damaged 8 battleships, destroyed hundreds of aircraft, and killed over 2,400 Americans. Newspapers in Tokyo proclaimed a glorious victory. Admiral Nagumo, who led the carrier strike force, turned his fleet around and began the long journey home. But beneath the surface of victory, there were cracks that would widen with each passing month. One of the most significant miscalculations was ideological. Japan's leaders underestimated the psychological effect the attack would have on American society. They believed that the United States was a fractured, distracted democracy, reluctant to enter another global war after the trauma of World War I. What they didn't expect was the almost unanimous call for vengeance that Pearl Harbor provoked. Overnight, isolationism in America collapsed. Political divisions disappeared. Even longtime opponents of intervention, such as Charles Lindbergh and members of Congress who had resisted war, now supported the conflict. American patriotism surged to levels the Japanese could not have anticipated. They had not just attacked a fleet, they had awakened a nation. Militarily, Japan had also failed to neutralize American strategic capacity. The submarine fleet, which would later strangle Japanese logistics and devastate merchant shipping, remained untouched. The shipyard facilities at Pearl Harbor, essential for repairing damaged vessels, were left intact. And the fuel tanks that supplied the Pacific Fleet, massive above-ground targets, were never bombed. Had they been destroyed, American naval operations in the Pacific would have been paralyzed for months. The reasons for these omissions were complex. Some Japanese commanders feared a prolonged engagement might endanger their carriers. Others believed the battleship losses were sufficient to delay American response. And still others clung to the belief that the United States would hesitate, would negotiate, would accept a new balance of power in the Pacific. They were wrong. In the months following the attack, Japan continued its lightning conquests: the Philippines, Hong Kong, Malaya, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies. For a brief moment, the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere seemed real. Tokyo ruled an empire stretching from Manchuria to the jungles of Burma. But each conquest added strain. Each new front required more men, more ships, more fuel, resources Japan could not easily replenish. Meanwhile, the United States was rearming at a staggering pace. Factories that once built cars now produced tanks, planes, and warships. By mid-1942, American shipyards were launching vessels faster than Japan could sink them. And then came Midway. In June 1942, just 6 months after Pearl Harbor, Admiral Yamamoto launched an ambitious plan to lure what remained of the U.S. fleet into a trap. His goal was to destroy the American carriers that had escaped the December attack. The Japanese deployed 4 carriers, believing they held the advantage in numbers and surprise. But again, they underestimated the Americans. Thanks to cryptanalysts at Station Hypo, the United States had broken portions of the Japanese naval code. American commanders knew the target was Midway. They prepared an ambush of their own. In a dramatic and chaotic battle, U.S. dive bombers found the Japanese carriers at their most vulnerable, deck loaded with fueled planes, unprepared for attack. In minutes, 3 of the 4 Japanese carriers were in flames. The 4th followed soon after. Japan had lost its best pilots, its most experienced crews, and the strategic initiative in the Pacific. It was a disaster from which they would never fully recover. Midway was not just a battle. It was a reckoning. Pearl Harbor had shocked the world, but it had not broken the United States. It had galvanized it. And now, at Midway, the balance began to shift. From this point forward, Japan would fight a defensive war, a war of attrition it could not hope to win. Back in Tokyo, the mood changed. What was once triumph turned to anxiety. The emperor was informed of the carrier losses. Public announcements were vague, hiding the full scale of the defeat. Internally, military leaders knew that the empire's window for expansion had closed. They had believed they could strike quickly, decisively, and force America to concede. They had believed wrong. And the cost of that miscalculation would only grow. As 1942 progressed, the scale of Japan's misjudgment became increasingly clear. They had expected Pearl Harbor to cripple American resolve. Instead, it had transformed the United States into a war machine, driven by purpose and vengeance. But the surprise at Pearl Harbor didn't just awaken a nation. It also forged an alliance. Britain, already fighting for survival, was now fully aligned with American might. Australia, threatened by Japan's expansion, became a critical staging ground. The Soviet Union, though focused on its own existential struggle with Nazi Germany, kept wary eyes on the East. Japan had not just picked a fight with one country, it had positioned itself against the greatest industrial alliance in human history. Even within Japan, there were voices of concern. Admiral Yamamoto, despite being hailed as the mastermind of Pearl Harbor, knew the risks from the beginning. "I can run wild for 6 months," he warned. "After that, I have no expectation of success." His words would prove prophetic. The 6-month mark passed, and with it, Japan's string of unbroken victories. One of the greatest unexpected consequences of Pearl Harbor was the rise of American naval aviation. Before the war, battleships were seen as the dominant force in naval strategy. Pearl Harbor changed that perception overnight. The damage to America's battleships forced a shift toward aircraft carriers, not by choice, but by necessity. And in doing so, the United States accelerated its transformation into a carrier-centric navy, pioneering tactics and technologies that would define modern naval warfare. Meanwhile, on the home front, the scale of America's mobilization astonished even its own leaders. The War Production Board coordinated a vast economic shift. Entire industries were converted to military output. Women entered the workforce in record numbers, filling roles in factories, shipyards, and laboratories. The Japanese had not expected a nation of civilians to become warriors so quickly, nor had they anticipated the industrial surge that followed. Japan, by contrast, was overextended. Its economy could not keep pace. Its merchant marine, essential for transporting oil and raw materials across its growing empire, became a target for American submarines. Each month, Japanese losses at sea grew more severe. The empire had gambled on a short war. It was now entangled in a long one. And then came the campaign in the Solomon Islands. In August 1942, American forces landed on Guadalcanal. It was the first major Allied offensive in the Pacific, and it stunned the Japanese. They had expected the Americans to remain on the defensive for much longer. Instead, they now faced a determined enemy, willing to fight and bleed for every inch of jungle, every airstrip, every coral atoll. The battle for Guadalcanal was brutal. Night battles at sea, deadly air raids, and vicious ground combat turned the island into a meat grinder. Both sides suffered heavily, but again, Japan miscalculated. Their ability to reinforce the island was hampered by growing naval losses and logistical challenges. Their elite pilots, already stretched thin after Midway, were depleted further in the struggle. By early 1943, Japan withdrew. The tide had turned. What the Japanese leadership failed to grasp was not just the military strength of the United States, but the cultural one. Americans had been attacked on their own soil, in a manner they perceived as cowardly. The nation responded not with fear, but with fury. Propaganda posters, war films, and rallying cries like, "Remember Pearl Harbor," unified the country in a way few events in American history ever had. That unity translated into overwhelming production. In 1943 alone, the United States built over 85,000 aircraft and thousands of ships. Japan could not match this scale. Each carrier they lost was nearly irreplaceable. Each experienced pilot killed was a blow to their shrinking pool of veterans. Strategically, Pearl Harbor had been designed to delay American action. Instead, it accelerated it. Every setback Japan suffered in 1943 and beyond could be traced, in part, to the attack on Pearl Harbor. It had failed to knock the United States out of the war. It had failed to destroy the carriers, the fuel reserves, the submarine fleet. But above all, it had failed to understand the American spirit, a force that, once awakened, would not stop until total victory was achieved. And that force was now moving across the Pacific, island by island. By 1944, the Pacific War had entered a new phase. The United States was no longer reacting. It was advancing, relentlessly, methodically, and with devastating power. Island after island fell: Tarawa, the Marshall Islands, Saipan, Guam, Tinian. Each battle brought American forces closer to Japan's home islands. Each victory exposed another layer of the empire's vulnerability. And each one was a reminder of what the Japanese had not expected when they attacked Pearl Harbor. They had expected a swift negotiation. What they got was a war of annihilation. As American forces pushed forward, they brought with them overwhelming logistics. Vast convoys carried supplies across the Pacific. Seabees, the U.S. Navy's construction battalions, built airfields and bases in record time. Bombers now reached deeper into Japanese territory. The Mariana Islands gave B-29s the range to strike the Japanese mainland. Tokyo, once untouchable, now trembled under waves of incendiary bombing. But there was more than fire from the skies. On the seas, American carrier groups dominated. Fast, mobile, and deadly, they struck wherever they pleased. Japan's once feared navy, now short on fuel and trained sailors, could not stop them. In June 1944, during the Battle of the Philippine Sea, mockingly dubbed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, Japan lost over 600 aircraft and hundreds of irreplaceable pilots. Their air power would never recover. What the Japanese had truly failed to predict was the scale of American adaptation. In the wake of Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Navy didn't just rebuild, it reinvented itself. Tactics evolved. Carrier operations became more precise, more lethal. Submarine warfare grew more aggressive, choking Japanese supply lines. New technologies, like radar, proximity fuses, and improved code breaking, gave the Allies a decisive edge. And back home, the engine of American industry was running at full speed. By 1944, the United States was producing more weapons, more planes, and more warships than all the Axis powers combined. Shipyards along the Atlantic and Pacific coasts launched a new vessel nearly every day. Entire fleets materialized within months. While Japan struggled to maintain its shrinking empire, the United States was building the tools to dismantle it. Yet even as the empire crumbled, Japanese leadership refused to surrender. Indoctrinated by a code of honor, shaped by a belief in divine destiny, they saw defeat as dishonor. American strategists, recognizing this, began to fear that an invasion of the Japanese home islands would cost millions of lives, both Allied and Japanese. So the United States sought to end the war by different means. But even before the atomic bomb, the scale of destruction had reached horrifying levels. In March 1945, the firebombing of Tokyo killed over 100,000 civilians in a single night. Cities across Japan were reduced to ashes. And still, the Japanese government resisted. The population prepared for invasion. Schoolchildren trained with bamboo spears. Civilians dug tunnels and shelters, expecting to fight to the death. This fanatic resistance was another consequence the Japanese military had not foreseen. By framing the war as one of national survival, they had created a monster of their own making. Surrender became unthinkable. And the longer the war dragged on, the worse the consequences became for their people. In April 1945, American forces landed on Okinawa, the last major island before reaching the Japanese mainland. The battle was a nightmare. Kamikaze attacks, civilian casualties, and brutal ground combat claimed over 200,000 lives. The Japanese strategy was no longer about victory, it was about making the cost of invasion unbearable. But America would not be stopped. The road to Hiroshima and Nagasaki began the day Pearl Harbor was attacked. The Manhattan Project, launched in secret shortly after the raid, had grown into the most ambitious scientific endeavor in history. It was a response not just to the threat of Axis powers, but to the belief that total war demanded total answers. By August 1945, Japan was on its knees. The atomic bombs were dropped not out of cruelty, but as a final push to end the nightmare. Hiroshima. Then Nagasaki. The devastation was immediate and unfathomable. On August 15, Emperor Hirohito addressed the Japanese people for the first time in history. His voice crackled over the radio, announcing surrender. He cited a new and cruel bomb. He spoke of enduring the unendurable. But behind those words was something else, a reckoning with the consequences of Pearl Harbor. The attack had been a gamble. A strike intended to intimidate, to delay, to dominate. Instead, it awakened a giant. It provoked not fear, but fury. Not retreat, but resolve. And once that force was unleashed, there was no turning it back. In the decades that followed the war, historians, soldiers, and survivors all returned to one moment, the morning of December 7, 1941. It was the spark, the turning point, the moment that changed the trajectory of the century. And yet, so much of what unfolded afterward was never part of Japan's plan. They didn't expect the carriers to be absent. They didn't expect the fuel reserves to remain untouched. They didn't expect the dry docks to survive. And they certainly didn't expect the United States to rise, enraged, unified, and determined to crush the empire that had struck so suddenly. Even militarily, the outcomes were not as Japan had hoped. They expected to eliminate America's ability to project power in the Pacific. Instead, they destroyed aging battleships while leaving newer, more strategic assets untouched. They thought their advantage in experienced pilots and aggressive tactics would give them dominance. But by 1943, most of their veteran airmen were gone, replaced by barely trained recruits facing superior American machines. Japan had not anticipated the sheer scale of American intelligence. The breaking of their naval codes turned carefully laid traps into fatal missteps. Their once feared ambushes became predictable. Their movements were shadowed. Even the famed Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, was intercepted and killed in 1943 after U.S. codebreakers discovered his flight plans. Each success of the Allies echoed the initial miscalculation. Pearl Harbor had not broken the enemy's will, it had forged it in fire. And in the United States, the cultural impact of Pearl Harbor became deeply embedded. Remember Pearl Harbor wasn't just a slogan, it was a moral cause, a justification, a unifying cry. It rallied soldiers, factory workers, and ordinary citizens alike. The attack became a symbol of betrayal and resilience, of treachery met with triumph. In a broader sense, the Japanese government misunderstood how democracies respond to crises. In a broader sense, the Japanese government misunderstood how democracies respond to crises. They believed a system based on debate and dissent would crumble under the pressure of war. But what they saw as weakness turned out to be strength. The diversity of thought, the decentralized power, the free press, all of it helped America adapt, innovate, and endure. Pearl Harbor also marked a strategic shift in global warfare. No longer would oceans guarantee safety. No longer would nations assume that geographic distance was protection. The world became smaller, more interconnected, more volatile. And within Japan, the seeds of change had been planted too. The war's devastation, the firebombings, the atomic attacks, and finally, the occupation by American forces, all of it transformed Japanese society. The militarism that had driven the empire faded. A new constitution, written under Allied supervision, embraced peace and democracy. The post-war decade saw Japan become a technological powerhouse, a staunch ally of the very nation it had once tried to destroy. The irony was not lost on many. What began as an attempt to preserve the Japanese empire ultimately ended it. The attack meant to force America into isolation pulled it onto the world stage permanently. The war launched by Japan to secure its dominance in Asia ended with two of its cities in ruins and its navy resting at the bottom of the Pacific. And still, Pearl Harbor remains a subject of fascination. Not just because of its scale or brutality, but because of how much it revealed about miscalculation, assumption, and the unpredictable nature of war. No war plan survives contact with the enemy, they say. But few plans have unraveled so completely, so dramatically, as Japan's vision for the Pacific. They believed they could strike, consolidate, and negotiate. What they faced was an adversary they could neither intimidate nor outlast. Every island lost, every ship sunk, every city bombed, each was a link in the chain that started that Sunday morning. And though Japan fought with immense courage, their leadership had misread history. They saw the world as it was in 1905, when Japan defeated Russia. But 1941 was a different era. And America was a different enemy. An enemy that, once provoked, would not stop until the world itself was reshaped. Today, over 8 decades later, Pearl Harbor still echoes, not just as a place, but as a moment frozen in time. The rusted hulk of the USS Arizona lies beneath the harbor's waters, a silent tomb for over 1,100 sailors. Visitors float above it, gazing into the depths, into history itself. For many, it's the first moment they truly grasp the cost of miscalculation, of underestimating not just an enemy, but a people's resolve. Every 7th of December, ceremonies are held, flags lowered, memories shared. Survivors, now few in number, recount the sounds, the smoke, the fear. But also the courage. The unity. The moment their lives, and the world, changed forever. Pearl Harbor was not just a military operation, it was a gamble, a message, a statement of empire. Japan sought to knock out America before it could become a threat. They didn't just fail. They triggered a chain reaction that would bring their empire to ruin, their cities to rubble, and their ideology to an end. The architects of the attack believed they had time. They believed America would flinch, hesitate, negotiate. They thought that a quick strike could freeze a giant in place. But they did not understand that this giant, once awakened, would move with unstoppable force. America responded not as a victim, but as a titan. Within 4 years, it had raised armies, built fleets, constructed a nuclear weapon, and remade the global order. The country that had seemed distant, distracted, was now everywhere, across oceans, inside skies, on every battlefield. And for Japan, that was the final, bitter truth. They had misunderstood the soul of their enemy. They had expected indecision, division, and delay. What they got was fury, innovation, and scale beyond imagining. Pearl Harbor also changed how nations prepare for war. No longer would distance or diplomacy be enough. It taught the world that surprise is a double-edged sword, capable of cutting deep, but also of provoking responses far worse than any initial blow. In strategy classes, Pearl Harbor is studied as both brilliance and disaster. Tactically effective. Strategically catastrophic. A reminder that success in the moment can lead to failure in the long term, especially when built on flawed assumptions. The United States of 1941 was not ready for war. But by 1945, it had become the most powerful force on the planet. That transformation began in fire, in smoke, and in silence, on a quiet Sunday morning when Japanese planes appeared out of a clear blue sky. And it was that moment, the moment of surprise, that sealed Japan's fate. Because while they thought they had bought time, what they had truly done was end theirs. The greatest thing the Japanese didn't expect was not resistance. It was resurrection. They didn't expect America to become stronger after being hit. They didn't expect its people to rally, to build, to fight with such conviction. They didn't expect the nation they tried to paralyze to rise from the harbor's wreckage with vengeance in its eyes and fire in its hands. But that is exactly what happened. Pearl Harbor was not the end of peace. It was the beginning of reckoning. And in the end, Japan did not fall because it was weak, but because it awoke something far stronger.